Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we have with us, I believe this is a first, actually. We have two guests. The first is Maximillian Alvarez, who is a columnist for the Baffler and the host of the Working Pod podcast. And we have Aisling McCrea. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did. That was beautiful.
Oh, thank Christ. Who is a contributing editor at Current Affairs. And so, yeah, thanks for coming on. Did I miss anything? Anything I should have plugged there?
Now, you got Aisling's very difficult name right, but you got the name of my podcast wrong.
What?
Oh, no.
So I'm teasing you. So the podcast is Working People, but our Twitter handle is Working Pod.
The Twitter handle is what matters.
Exactly.
Listen to Working People. Find it at at Working Pod.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Yeah, if you want to listen to me interview workers from around the country and go on way too many political rants, check us out.
Awesome. Yeah, our listeners definitely enjoy rants. Otherwise, they wouldn't listen to us.
So thanks for coming on. We have
welcome.
a kind of grab bag of topics today. The first one is, why is there no great conservative commentary? And comedy, not commentary. Making some.
You're right about both.
Yeah, that's true. Sort of a Biden gaffe there, or John Kerry gaffe. You have a whole spectrum of very successful comedians on the left. Every late night show, even the ones that aren't like too good, they all have a sort of broadly left of center perspective. I tend to watch the Colbert stuff, and Colbert, even if you don't agree with his politics, I don't think he's right about everything. Like, he's inarguably a good comedian. You got Chapo, various other sort of comedic enterprises coming from the left. Right-wing efforts to try to replicate that or imitate it have just fallen on their face. And so, what is going on there? And maybe to set us up, my initial take on this is that comedy requires us at least a modicum of playfulness. One of the key aspects of humor is being, not too serious. And the problem with conservative humor is that it tends to just sort of divert into spittle-flecked outrage halfway through the joke. You can't land the punchline because you're not actually thinking about the structure of the joke as such. You're just sort of like trying to be incredibly pissed off about Benghazi or, the Mueller investigation or libs being triggered by this or that. There's no sort of playfulness there. You can't be playful if all you have is anger. But that's a very unsophisticated, not a comedy expert, not terribly funny myself. So I'm interested to get, various alternative perspectives from the real experts.
So I think that might be part of the reason, but I don't think it's necessarily the whole reason, because you do definitely get liberal or left comics who do like rants. So you have people like Bill Hicks or like George Carlin and stuff who they would go
Yes.
on rants that were still funny, like they were mad, but they were like, I guess, righteously mad or whatever however you want to put it. I think so. My theory as to one of the main reasons why conservative comedy doesn't work very well is that in order to understand what is funny about something, you need to understand the thing. And I think conservatism often comes down to not wanting to understand things. So one of the reasons I was thinking about this, I don't know if it got any traction in the US at all. I don't think it did. But there was recently a conservative parody columnist called Titania McCrea. Who did anyone follow this or see this?
Nope.
I unfortunately not.
Okay, so it was basically a parody of a sort of woke SJW type character who would go on Twitter and say things like, I think the Queen should be non-binary, or whatever the thing was. And they were recently revealed, oh, surprise, surprise, this sort of 30-year-old woman is actually a 45-year-old male bald columnist. I don't actually know if he's bald, but in my mind he's bald. He's spiritually bald. And he did a bunch of sort of interviews in some of the main UK papers talking about how, he felt he had to do this character because, you can't say things anymore, and the PC culture and the blah, blah, blah. And lots of the sort of intellectual dark web type people were, very interested in how brilliant and satirical this thing was. And the thing was, okay, so I've been a leftist for a very long time, but before I was a leftist, I was a comedy nerd. And the main problem is it's just really, really shit. Just unbelievably shit. And all the jokes were a variation. So they did this column where it's like, the royal family, they should all be trans and they should have a non-binary baby and they should identify as a tree or whatever. It was the same like the 4chan jokes from 2013, And I think the thing is that you have to understand what's funny about things. And the funny thing is, if you want to satirize the left, there's a lot of things that are funny about the left. If you wanted to satirize an interminable 4-hour meeting or ridiculous infighting over theorists who've been dead for 150 years that no one else cares about except for 2 academics who are just completely mad at each other about something that will never matter in any way, and the different characters you meet, there's a lot of interesting stuff, but you would have to actually know about that stuff. And I think I think part of the reason I got invited on was because I said one of the best comedy bits that's ever been done about the left is the Monty Python and the Holy Grail bit where King Arthur meets some peasants who have formed an anarcho-syndicalist commune. And part of the reason why that is funny is because, when you watch it and you're a kid, first of all, your first response might be haha, what is this, silly politics thing? And then you get older and you find out, that's actually, a legit thing. And the character actually describes it pretty well. And it's not even that the character is wrong, because he's right. He's living in a feudal society and he's saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't, the famous line, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government, right? Which is still a really memorable line. And it's a correct line. It's not that, it's inherently funny that this person thinks something different. It's that the context is, he's got a massively inflated ego and a massively overinflated sense of his power in the situation, and keeps banging on about things while the woman who forms the other part of the commune gets on with doing the work, which is something that I think a lot of leftists can recognize in themselves, right? So that's kind of part of why I think conservative comedy doesn't work, is because they don't really take an interest in what the left is. So when they try to satirize the left, they sort of fail to see what's funny about it. And I think that's also true about other things they come across in general.
Yeah, I would also add, in the Monty Python canon, the in Life of Brian, the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front, and the satirizing the splitism and the dogmatism of sort of pseudo revolutionary activists. It's just really, I mean, it reflects a knowledge of like the actual circumstances. And I think these, like a lot of the Python guys were actually like philosophy majors and studied political theory and stuff. And so they sort of knew what they were talking about. And it wasn't this distorted caricature filtered through right-wing media that it was just like, ridiculous caricatures.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you see, like, I still hear leftists that I know, like, sarcastically refer to, there's some split somewhere and they say, oh, it's a bit People's Front of Judea. And people on the left and the right and apolitical people all still use that reference. And that's how you know that it's good, because, like, there's a truth to that, right? I think there's also, again, I don't know how much clout it has in the US, but one of the most famous like leftist caricatures in UK comedy was from this sitcom in the 80s called The Young Ones, which was about like 4 students living together in a house. And one of the students is this character Rick, who is like a self-proclaimed anarchist who's actually just like really soft and obnoxious and doesn't really know anything. And that show was written by like half or a good chunk of the writing team were like big leftists. So it goes to show like there are things that you can poke fun at, but you would need to have some knowledge about them first in order to make it something that's worthwhile and that lasts.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I wonder too if that isn't bound up with the types of political ideologies that we're dealing with. Leftism cares about critique, and to critique you have to know well, the enemy, and to know well that with which you are trying to battle and overcome. And in some sense, it seems to me that conservatism is kind of about not reflecting. It's about ignorance or ignorance of the legitimacy of those claims for equality and for sharing the power. And so in some sense, it has to not care about the truth because it's on the wrong side, right, of reality, it seems. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's about...
let me jump in on that point. Because, like, I joked when we were kind of talking about doing this episode that, I had a very esoteric training for my BA and my master's where I wrote, theses on the philosophy of comedy and Russian literature. So now I'm like pulling, it's like pulling the Batman suit out of like the attic and blowing the dust off. I'm like, this is the fucking time I was waiting for to use this knowledge. So
not a baby.
So like first I would definitely say that we should do a follow-up of some sort after we all watch like what looked like just an absolutely horrible movie. The one that like Tim Allen joined. It was called like No Safe Spaces or something. I remember seeing like the trailer to it, and it looked so fucking bad. And I mean, I think for all the reasons that you guys are pointing out. And I know that there's also like there's that like comedy show, The Deplorables, that's like going around right now. I mean, it really hasn't kind of been talked about much in leftist circles, and I sure as hell don't want to be the one to report on it. But I imagine Ashling and Nathan over at Current Affairs will have someone on it soon enough. But for kind of thinking about comedy in like this kind of long, because it really is, it's like one of the hardest questions to solve in philosophy. Right? I mean, there are so many different schools of thought because it's such a context-dependent thing, and it does evolve so much with kind of the shape of society, cultural norms, the structures of power, and so on and so forth. And so from like Aristotle to Hobbes to like Freud and yada, yada, yada. I mean, like, there are so many people who have tried to, like, kind of pinpoint what makes us laugh. And it's never really a fully satisfying answer. But I do think there is kind of one school of thought that, like, is actually kind of applicable to like, the question of why does conservative comedy suck? And, I mean, it's the kind of the school of thought about comedy that I kind of tend to gravitate towards myself. And it's basically called, like, the incongruity theory. right? And this is like coming from people like Arthur Schopenhauer, Henri Bergson, and so on and so forth. But basically, like, the gist of it is kind of what we were already saying, right? Like, at its core, comedy is kind of like what emerges when there is an incongruity, when there's a clash between, like, how things are and how they should be, right? Or how things are or how we expect them to be. There has to be some
a man in
sort of
a fancy suit getting hit with a pie in the face.
Exactly. Right? I mean, like, you know, and this is kind of where you start, I think, getting into different categories of comedy, because you can get really deep with it and say, like, you know, comedy comes when there's an incongruity between, like, the natural order and the ways that, like, humans have fucked it up. Or if you're talking about, like, satire, right? I mean, there's the question of, like, how kind of the ideological ideal says society is supposed to be and how it actually ends up looking, right? So, like, so that incongruity kind of theory, I think, does have some kind of explanatory power. And in the context of, like, kind of satire as kind of being something that is intimately linked with, like, the kind of historical social conditions of a certain time and place, and that, as you guys said, like, kind of offers a critique of that, and the critique is baked in to kind of recognizing that there is an incongruity here between how things should be and how they are, or how the people in power want things to be and how we are experiencing them kind of on the ground. Like, that is kind of really the great, you know, wellspring of I think a lot of satirical comedy. But, like, when with conservatives today, right, like, they are kind of they're on this side of the fence that is divided between, like, having some sort of a critique of power, right? Like, pointing out again that there is an incongruity between the way things should be and the way they are, versus, like, an embrace of power and a kind of punching down critique of the powerless. And this is, like, something that seems to be, like, just fully embraced by conservatives. And, you know, when you live in a society in which power is so concentrated and so dependent upon, like, widespread forms of exploitation, discrimination, and domination, like, the odds just aren't in your favor that the audience you're looking for will be on the same side of power as your comedy is, right? And so I guess to wrap up this long rant is, like, the genre of conservative comedy that I think I do find funny. And I guess the first person who, like, comes to mind is, like, in, like, the Blue Collar Comedy Tour. Like, I love Ron White. I think he's hilarious. And my family loves him. And I grew up very Catholic, very conservative. So, like, there are kind of aspects to that sort of dry, conservative-leaning comedy that I find, like, very funny. And it goes back to that kind of incongruity theory. And it's something that we on the left make fun of a lot, too. Right? Because it's incongruous when someone is so kind of dominated by ideology or by kind of, like, just habitual routines of, you know, whether it's, like, kind of, you know, thinking that the Mueller report is going to, like, save everybody. And you become so kind of like mechanical in the way that you have that faith that, like, that you don't even realize that you're walking off a cliff, right? And this is what Bergson, like, wrote about in the incongruity theories. He was like, you know, comedy comes when there's an incongruity between the way that people are supposed to be elastic and learn and adapt to their situations, and when they actually are just walking around being really fucking, like, rigid and mechanical. And I think that conservatives can point out when people get so mechanically locked into a certain way of thinking or a certain way of acting. And that's something that, you know, leftists also kind of make fun of, right? I mean, it's that sort of dogmatism and rigidity that makes what should be a very kind of adaptive human thing into just kind of this flat, dumb, you know, like, witless archetype.
Yeah, well, I guess
Right.
that's
In the same way that... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess it's also for them, the conservative comedians, I guess, they probably think that, but then their perspective is reversed, right? So when they see the left, or liberals, I suppose, as being inflexible in the sense they feel, oh, I say this thing and then someone accuses me of being racist, or, someone's asking me to use a certain word instead of that certain word. And there are certain things that you can make where, you can say that things are, you can point to individual instances where someone's being inflexible or whatever. But I think also it's just, I don't think it's going to date well, because if you're getting really, really mad that someone asked you to use a different word because it's more polite, then that's not really them that's being the inflexible one. And so I think a lot of this stuff is just not really, it might get a laugh among a certain audience for a certain amount of time, but I don't think it's going to date well.
Right. It strikes me that you're talking about the difference between that incongruity, which I would say can do a few things, right? The incongruity could snap you into thinking or snap you out of thinking, almost like a Zen koan can snap you out of thinking and break the mold of kind of your just routine expectations, thoughts about the normal, and make you see something in a fresh light. And so the kind of good humor I think we're talking about is helpful and insightful to kind of let you gain perspective, which is what I think education often does. You see from a different perspective, and then you see things in a new light. Whereas what you're talking about, Aisling, I think is mere kind of sympathy or the kind of affective response that, say, Trump, people on the right that love Trump, he's not satiric. He mocks and he's cruel. And so they kind of get off on feeling that visceral response to the cruelty and the mockery that is its own kind of release from the rote way of thinking and the expectations that kind of can suppress and oppress. But the conservatism that maybe Max was talking about being actually humorous seems to me to be illiberal in a way that might also be insightful, in the same way that a Ross Douthat is terrible in many ways, but when he critiques liberalism sometimes you kind of go, yeah, your solution's wrong, Ross, but I agree with that critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aisling is absolutely right, because this is kind of the great historical joke of most conservative comedians today, and not even conservative. A lot of the older comedians today have themselves become the punchline of not understanding how comedy works, right? Because if I hear another old comedian whine about how everyone's too PC today, I'm going to lose my fucking mind, because comedy is always that sort of, like I said, that context-dependent thing where you were kind of reaching into the kind of the rich stuff in people's, the gut of everyday life, right? That people are affectively, psychologically, culturally kind of tied to. The things that they are tied to enough that they can feel that response to a seeming incongruity when a comedian points it out. But now you have a bunch of comedians who are themselves being so goddamn rigid in their understanding of what comedy is this ahistorical thing that what's funny is just funny, that they don't realize that they themselves have become these kind of cymbal smashing monkeys who can only do one fucking trick and can't adapt to the world that they live in.
Oh yeah, I mean, have you ever...
And so instead of teaching us something... No, go ahead.
Have you ever tried to listen to 10, 15 minutes of Lenny Bruce? It fucking sucks, man. No one has ever enjoyed a Lenny Bruce routine in the last 35 years, I promise you. And it's not because he wasn't important. It's just because his routines were so specific to a certain place and a certain time. Half of the jokes, unless you're very, very into the history of the time, you're not even going to get the references. And even the ones that you do, it's more you're going to be like, oh, I get that, the thing. It just, comedy dates. And, some types of comedy date better than others. But I completely agree with you, Max, that there's so many comedians who seem to confuse audience won't laugh at this thing because it's not PC. With the audience doesn't laugh at that thing because it's just not funny anymore, and it's not because it's, you're afraid to laugh. It just isn't funny. So, for example, a lot of people were upset recently because Family Guy, the writers of Family Guy said they were going to phase out gay jokes. Personally, I was surprised that Family Guy was still running at all, but nonetheless, it's not because you're not allowed, but it's just, although obviously, homophobia hasn't been completely eradicated, there's not the taboo that makes the idea of just being gay in itself a funny thing in the same way that there was 20, 30 years ago, right? Humor is context dependent, and you're not going to get a laugh from the same things once the social issues change, right? Being gay has become more or less sort of normalized in the culture, so you can't just get a laugh from saying something's gay. It's just not an inherently funny thing anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess one last thing that I would add to kind of build on Ashling's point is what do we mean? What do these comedians mean when they say they're not allowed to say X anymore? Right? I mean, there's such a deep sense of entitlement to people's laughter and to people's adoration that, again, just misses the kind of, I think, democratic core of what comedy is and how elusive it is and how much kind of attentive work you have to do to find it, right? I mean, what they're saying is that, I can't go in front of a club and just be uniformly laughed at anymore, or I can't say something on Twitter without people, just ripping my shit. And it's just okay, but that's not like someone telling you can't say that. That's not the government putting a muzzle on your mouth. That's just you facing the reality of, not kind of being attuned to or working within kind of the feelings, sentiments, and ideas and values of the society that you live in. And if you want to keep doing that comedy, fine, fucking do it. But complaining that you're just not getting the same kind of adoration and success that you did at a different time in a different place, you're not fucking entitled to that. So stop holding us accountable for the fact that you won't do your work as a comedian.
It's almost as if,
amen, brother. If we don't give Brian a second, he'll never talk this whole episode. So we got to give him a chance. He's like a Western cowboy, but he's a little slow on the draw. He would get killed in the we would all outdraw him and kill him. Go ahead, Ryan.
That's very kind of you. The worst cowboy in the West, but no, I think you're absolutely right, Max, and I just wanted to draw out us a specific example of this. The overarching lesson you're talking about here is that comedy is difficult. And it's culturally, you have to have some cultural sensitivity. You have to be in touch with the sort of norms of the moment and so on. And in 2007, Fox News tried to do this they call it the Daily Show for Conservatives. And it was called the Half-Hour News Hour. And it ran for a few months, from February to September 2007, and it just got panned. They didn't cancel it because of the reviews. They canceled it because the viewership collapsed, because it wasn't entertaining television, and it wasn't entertaining television because the jokes all sucked, and they sucked because it was extremely lazy, and you can see that because they ripped off the title of their show from a Canadian show, which is still going, I believe. It's called This Hour Has 22 Minutes, which is sort of a satirical take on from a Canadian show on sort of overhyped news broadcast, but it's successful and been going since 1993. And they saw the success of The Daily Show and they said, oh, we want to replicate that. But they didn't understand or even try to replicate the effort. It was like, we're going to take the propaganda Fox News style in which we just sort of like do incredibly ham-fisted and cynical bad faith takes on everything, global warming, and, like, oh, we're going to recycle breast implants. I think that was one of the jokes they had on there. And it just fell completely flat because they never studied the craft of comedy, which is a difficult thing. And that, I think it sort of emerges from all the stuff that you're talking about that, it's like, this shit isn't easy. Like being a Trump lickspittle maybe takes its own sort of skill, and just saying Donald Trump right every day, like, fuck you, liberals are wrong, Benghazi, fucking Hillary Clinton, whatever. Like, but if you're trying to be funny, that's a different kettle of fish. And, that it's just, you can't just sort of jump in and thinking it's sort of ham-fistedly aping the forms of something like The Daily Show without any thought about the what makes it work. It's just going to fail. And
it's
even in the context of, go ahead.
It's almost as if when they want to just like do these jokes and be laughed at, it's almost as if they want like a space that's safe. Like I don't know what you would call that, but like,
I don't know. Yeah.
It's almost like they won a participation trophy.
That's right. Just for attempting the comedy.
No, but I mean, like, yeah, you're absolutely right, because this is like the same reason that, a lot of liberal comedy has really run out of steam. Like, I can't watch The Daily Show anymore because it's like, oh, haha, Trump is orange and wears suits that don't fit him. Like, I mean, like, that just doesn't have any gas anymore, right? I mean, there's no real kind of work being done there. And, like, again, it's just this kind of like, sense of entitlement, really at the heart of what people feel like they're supposed to get from comedy more than anything else.
And I think that's tied to the fact that conservatives and liberals are capitalists. And capitalists, besides not caring about the truth, are also lazy. And not just are they lazy, but in an ever increasingly disastrous world where truth and action and like kind of all the things that comedy can inspire when properly done, which is like jolting people into realizing what's messed up, as you put, Max, like what should be and what's fucked up about the world. An ever increasing need for that kind of insight. You have less and less tolerance, I think, for the kind of status quo bullshit humor, whether it's conservative or liberal, that just acts as if all these terrible things aren't happening and just tries to be glib.
That's a good. I think that's a good capstone on that topic. Shall we move forward to our second question, which is that history for history's sake is a nightmare. Max, you proposed this one, so maybe you should bring it up. What do you mean by history for history's sake, and why is that
Max,
a nightmare?
my understanding is you're trying to make history with this topic, so I hope you accomplish that.
This is a historical first. I mean, we even started the podcast with it, right? This is the first time Left Anchor has had two interviewees on. Like, this is history, folks, and that's why you should be listening.
First time ever. It happened here. That's right.
Like, there are balloons falling in my office. Where the fuck did those even come from? Like, well, like, so, I mean, I think that they're actually like intimately connected, right? Because it's a really kind of big source of comedy, I think, if you look at it in a certain way, or it can be just like really fucking dark. But I guess that's the beauty of comedy, is it kind of ballet steps its way through kind of the worst and best kind of parts of being human. And I guess to go back to the question of like incongruity and like this incongruous kind of notion of humanity, this notion of an incongruity between like humans as adaptive, flexible beings and human beings who are just so kind of mechanically reduced to flat characters, whether that be through archetypes, through ideology, or through just kind of pure unthinkingness. So like if you're walking down a street and you're just so focused on your phone that you don't even see that you're about to walk into a fountain, like that would be what Bergson would write, is like you're acting like a machine, right? And that's and that means that you're incongruous with kind of what a human being should be, and that's why it's funny, right? Like that's kind of what I'm seeing with this kind of just liberal obsession with history for history's sake. And so I guess what I mean by that is probably best kind of concretized in a couple of headlines that I pulled. So like I write about kind of history itself a lot. Like history is like as a concept, history as kind of like a very political practice and a politically contested thing. But like I said that on Twitter that I really wanted to write a piece that would be about kind of like how the like grotesque liberal world came to see history for history's sake as like a good thing, or just making history as a thing, like that being a value in itself. And this was in response to this reporter Tim Knowles tweeting out a Bloomberg article about Bill Gates finally joining Jeff Bezos as one of the world's 200 billionaires, right? And so Tom Knowles, he tweeted out, for the first time ever, the world now contains two people worth 100 billion, with Gates at 100 billion and Bezos at 146 billion. Their combined fortune is worth more than the GDP of 143 different countries. Like the very first part of that, for the first time ever, like that's doing so much heavy ideological lifting that I think has just kind of become so accepted in kind of the neoliberal order of things that we kind of don't stop to ask like why we're so obsessed with it and what it means that we are so unthinkingly kind of driven by this quest for historical firsts. Because I guess to flesh this out, there's another headline from Politico earlier this year that just like it had me in fits laughing, I guess back to the point of comedy. So this was by David Brown at Politico, and the headline and subtitle read, "How Women Took Over the Military-Industrial Complex. For the first time, the nation's defense hierarchy is no longer dominated by men." And I remember laughing because some Washington reporter like tweeted this and was like, "Who run the world?" and like with the emoji of like high heels or something. And I was like, Jesus Christ. Right? I mean, like we're so focused on kind of this notion of historical first that we don't even kind of stop to think about just like how horrifying the history that we're making actually is. And I mean, like it can be as sinister as something like the military-industrial complex now being run by predominantly women. Or it can be something a little more, I guess, like anodyne or just kind of lame, like when you watch the Oscars, right? I mean, like, I saw a CNN headline that I quoted for this, and it was by Brian Lowry, and it was the title of the article was "The 2019 Oscars were marked by inclusiveness and firsts," and like, I mean, the category of Oscar first has kind of become like an award in itself, right? And it's kind of become, like one of the main reasons that people watch. Like the entire show has kind of become this exhausted parody of itself, whose only real draw, like does seem to come from touting these historical milestones. And so I guess to kind of, open this up, like, Yeah, I know it's a kind of a difficult needle to thread because, like, obviously equality is a principle that, like, liberals and the left are both nominally invested in, right? You know, in comparison to, like, the gendered and racialized caste systems and social hierarchies that have just been so thoroughly imbricated in American life in the past, you know, in comparison to that, then the principle of greater diversity and equality of access and assessment and yada yada yada, like that's good. That's better, right? It's a good thing that, you know, people of color are winning awards that were predominantly only won by white people, right? I mean, that like, I'm not going to shit on that, but you know, like it's obviously, like, that's not enough. There's a lot more kind of working, you know, under the surface here. I think, you know, any good leftist will point out that, you know, making sure diverse identities are represented in the halls of power doesn't really mean shit if the structural conditions and the political and economic apparatuses of governance stay where they are and keep reproducing, you know, like, more widespread inequalities and injustices, like, upon which big dangerous things like white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, and you know, cis hetero patriarchy, that all those things are predicated upon. And so this is why we really, you know, have to kind of subscribe to the notion that it's not about diversifying, it's about decolonizing these kinds of power structures and material institutions and so on and so forth. So there's that really kind of essential core critique of the critique of diversity that I think should be included in the discussion. But I think what's more kind of obsessing me at the moment is, like, the ideological function that historical firsts are serving in the kind of liberal mindset and in the kind of preservation of the kind of neoliberal hegemonic order, right? I mean, because with each historical first, it seems to be like just a little extra notch in the kind of deep set belief that, like, we are, you know, approaching history's apex, right? Or that, like, we have kind of reached the finish line of the end of history, and now all we need moving forward is for people from different identities and classes to kind of catch up and be included in that system, right? So, like, so there is this kind of really weird kind of obsession with even fetishization of, like, history for history's sake that really, I think, says a lot about what we do and don't understand about history and our own kind of ideological conditioning. So that's kind of what I wanted to open up to you all. Like, what are your thoughts on historical firsts and the obsession with them?
That's great. There's a lot in there, Max. Thank you for that. Just a few quick thoughts, if I may. And I want to talk about what I think you're pointing out that is both flawed in the liberal and conservative kind of political ideologies and the assumptions, the metaphysical assumptions and different failings. So I think what you're pointing out in terms of let's start with the liberals, right? So we all know kind of the memes or the tweets with the claps and, like, hire more female prison guards or like, you know, the students that I teach are often at a loss when I say, is it good for feminism that there's a female CIA director that endorses torture? Is that, like, progress? And they really have a hard time with that. And it's because liberalism is so individualistic that it doesn't understand that the reason that sexism and racism are bad is because those are indicative of broader infringements upon the equality of all human beings. And the ways in which power causes anyone to suffer is a problem. And so just if you, like, replace who's doing the oppression with somebody that is formerly not used to power, that doesn't make it good, because we want all people to not be oppressed, right? So it doesn't really matter if someone's gain is a gain to a position of oppression, right? So like the liberal inability to see, I think, structural oppression and the ways in which like identity politics is problematic if you don't see how difference shouldn't just be valued, but also difference and its relationship to power and oppression needs to be understood, right? So that's on that side. On the other side, of course, like conservatives, when they make illiberal critiques, can sometimes be right about that. But because they see a lot of times like what needs to be honored, right? And so the liberalism problem here, of course, with the firsts is in not knowing what to honor, because liberalism is about procedures. It doesn't understand substance. It kind of takes like any content or value judgment out of it, and it's all about proceduralism. So like the winning or the first or the most is all like that can be celebrated, right? And so it has this kind of neutrality that it pretends to have, right? So conservatives see that as nonsense, and so that that's why you get the participation trophy critiques, because conservatives want to conserve what is honored, right? Going back to Aristotle, you honor, right, something that's excellent with respect to the essence of the thing that you're doing, right? So like if you're playing the flute, right, you're a great flute player, then you're virtuous with respect to playing the flutes, and so on and so forth, right? The problem with that is conservatives don't understand the ways in which, right, those with power shape the cultural norms about what should be honored. And so you have that other side of it. And so like leftists are trying to properly both respect how power shapes norms and values without disregarding the ways that oppression, right, is not just a neutral, liberal, procedural thing, right?
Yeah, one thing that kind of interests me about this is that deciding like what firsts are noteworthy is inherently arbitrary, right? Because there's firsts going on all the time, right? Today was probably the first time I ate a cheese sandwich while wearing a certain pair of socks while listening to a certain kind of music, right? There's firsts happening all the time, so that's not an inherently noteworthy thing. So I think there's this sort of weird pursuit of novelty to try and make things look like they're progressing when they're not, and not really looking at the substance. So I remember when with Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos scammer, even before all that stuff unraveled, I remember hearing people saying, "Oh, she's the youngest female self-made billionaire," and I was like, "That's a lot of like." That's a really specific category. And then, of course, the next person after that is going to be, oh, this is the youngest female self-made billionaire who wasn't a scammer. And, it can you can find any sort of specific category. And just by a numbers game, you're always going to find, oh, this is the first person from such and such group to do such and such thing. But you're not really answering the question of, is this a substantively good thing? One thing it kind of reminds me of is it's similar logic to when you have like a really shitty industry, like let's say the private health insurance industry in the US, and one of the criticisms you get is, oh, but if you bring in public healthcare, we'll lose jobs, right? And the answer to that, of course, is, well, you could have a puppy killing factory, and you could shut it down and you would lose jobs. That's not an inherently negative thing for society as a whole. You've got to look at these more substantive critiques and say, well, maybe we don't want to have a universe where people go to work in a puppy killing factory. Maybe.
I dare say it would be positive to shut down the puppy killing factory. I'm just going to go out on a limb there. I don't know. I mean, I've heard some convincing arguments on either side. Yeah, personally, I'm on the fence about it. That's true. Got to take both sides into account. That's a fair point. Yep.
Yeah, this brings to mind two aspects of this sort of like history fetishism that I've noticed over the years. The first one I would say is the presidency of James Polk, who is, I would say, consistently ranked in the sort of top tier of American presidents because he was very effective at doing history. And one of his historical feats was he ginned up a war with Mexico and stole half their territory, and that was a great success. That's Mexico, California, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and he was very effective at just conquering this very poor country, which didn't do anything to offend the U.S. imperialists at the time, but getting his agenda done, he was really good at that, and so he was a great president.
He's why we have those hats, "Make America Mexico Again."
We should have a sitcom called "Queer as Polk," and it's just like a kind of kind of like introspective into kind of like the zany kind of happenings in the Polk administration, as like in the background he's just like fucking annexing huge swaths of occupied territory and like just being really racist and a shitty human being. So someone get on that.
Yeah, and it's a good part of the autobiography of Ulysses Grant, who was a quartermaster and a soldier in the Mexican-American War, where he was just like, this is fucking bullshit what we're doing down here. There's no reason for it.
Can we call him Odysseus S. Grant? Because that would be a first.
Odysseus. But the second thing that comes to mind is this book by Lester Spence, which is called "Knocking the Hustle," and it's about the sort of neoliberalization of black culture and specifically hip hop culture. There's a song he gets into which is called like "Hustle Hard," I believe. And it's all about, basically grinding your way to, making lots of money and, sort of submitting yourself to business discipline, whether that's in the form of, working for some sort of legal enterprise or just selling drugs or whatever. It's like, as long as you get that money, you're okay. And going through the history of many, black elected officials who have conducted what I would, characterize as extremely racist policies of mass incarceration and, welfare cuts and just sort of like oppressing the underclass through this kind of ideology. And I think it speaks to your point, Max, about how, there's a lot to be said about identity representation. Like, it's good to have the first black president. It's good to have, the first woman president, if that happens to be the case. And so on and so forth. The first, was it Leon Blum in France, the first Jewish prime minister of France. But that's not enough. You have to couple it to a structural understanding of politics to actually achieve the egalitarian outcomes, which the sort of anti-racism project is sort of aimed at. And you can't just rely on people being the right shade or whatever to achieve that. And in fact, it's a danger if you aren't careful, because people can be bought off. I mean, and this is sort of the flip side of the egalitarian ethos, is that black people, women, brown people can be just as corrupt and murderous as the worst white people. Cory Booker taking tons of money from Big Pharma and defending Bain Capital in 2012 under the relentless assaults of Barack Obama. And so, it's like you got to keep those two things in mind at the same time. And it's difficult, and again, identity matters. It really does. I think back on that that picture that hung on the wall of the Obama White House of there's like a 5-year-old kid who was like feeling the hair of Obama, just is like, oh yeah, this is just like mine. That's just an extraordinarily powerful symbol. Or him sitting in the bus that Rosa Parks sat in. But at the same time, you actually have to do the egalitarian policy, and they got to mesh together.
I think also, even with that representation, it's interesting what types of representation, or where we're drawn towards looking at representation. I don't remember ever seeing something about, oh, here's this great female or gay union leader, for example, right? It's always in very specific sort of neoliberal centers of power. But even if you want to talk about the importance of representation, different identities, it matters where that attention is drawn, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Go ahead, Mick.
Oh, I think that's a really great point about kind of that again. It speaks to the kind of the ideological work that this obsession with historical forces or first is really doing, right? I mean, like Aisling said, like the fact that only certain firsts are really kind of being held up and within certain contexts, like and held up in a very certain way. I mean, like they're again, like that's kind of like what's kind of been stuck in my head for all this time, because I've written kind of versions of this article before. I mean, like one of the first things I ever wrote for the Baffler was this piece called 2016 A Liberal Odyssey. And it was about, like, because I was feeling the very same way about that I'm feeling now about when people would be like, how could Trump voters say this? It's 2016, or like it's 2016, we shouldn't have to deal with X or yada yada. It's like the it's 2016 thing doesn't mean shit, right? I mean, but it belies this kind of again this necessary fetish that people make out of history that kind of allows them to I don't know, I think just kind of continue to be kind of good, abiding, liberal subjects. And I think like one of the kind of reasons that I find it to be like so sinister, along with like the what we've already talked about, it's like, how it just kind of reinscribes the existing inequalities and injustices of the kind of hegemonic neoliberal order, yada yada yada, and it kind of serves to buttress that order itself. So like that's obviously a huge problem, but like even underneath that, right, like it does kind of bear some sort of like allegiance to this inherent kind of conservatism, this conservative way that liberals kind of, and the liberal people within the liberal mindset kind of tend to think about progress itself, right? I mean, in the same yes. way that like conservatives are always pining for like a paradise lost, right? A time when society made more sense to them that we have to kind of return to. Like the liberal mindset has a very similar, like it's almost a mirror image way of understanding the future as kind of being this this thing that we are always on the right side of, right? Like this is always couched in like we are on the right side of history. And what that fundamentally misses is that history's right side is always determined by a vicious and endless political struggle. And it seems like yes. kind of thinking about history in these kinds of ways as just like a thing whose end has already been preordained, and whose like kind of these historical firsts just kind of serve to remind us that we are in fact at this kind of fantastical endpoint of history. What we're also doing there is that we're also kind of genuflecting before this notion that history itself is not and does not need to be fought for, and fought for over and over again, day after day, and that the right side of it is what we can make of it.
Right. No, it's almost like Max. I was reading John Dewey not that long ago, and he made an interesting point about there are some liberals who were once radicals, or some radicals who become liberals, and what he was trying to say is that, like, at some point what they were offering politically was radical, but then they won, and that was the end of the horizon of possibility. And so, as maybe a poor example, let's say Obamacare at one point was like, whoa, that's never going to happen, right? Okay, then it happened, and then the person that was pushing for something new and perhaps breaking through a norm, though that person then and those people then became conservative and like, okay, we've achieved that. That's good. That's what we want. That's it. Game over. Right. And so, like, what was once more radical becomes somewhat conservative and becomes liberal. And like that then is the order to be defended. And progress is really just keeping that established order as kind of like, so even these firsts are all within the same parameters of the same kind of old identity politics of like tokenism and like whatever, because like that's progress, right? And so there's something about the conservatism you're talking about that strikes me as that kind of complacency that comes from what perhaps was once a struggle and a more radical position that then stops fighting because there was something accomplished and that was just enough.
I have a comment on this.
Go ahead.
Francis Fukuyama, more like Francis Fuck You Yama.
This is a left.
That's got to be the open. That's got to be the open.
This is a left anchor first, folks. We got Fukuyama.
Yes.
We got Fukuyama puns in the mix. More like Francis Fukuyama. It's funny too because this article that I wrote for Boston Review, like back in the fall, on Francis Fukuyama and on the end of history kind of thesis, just went live online today, and it's kind of like, it's all about this, and I guess it kind of even adds to this like gumbo of shit that we're talking about, that like we are also kind of like living in a time where it's like only one side recognizes that history is something that is fought over. So like when we see like, just absolute shit ghouls like Dinesh D'Souza kind of like going on book tours and talking about how the left are the real Nazis, right? And like, when Trump like kind of tweets out that like Frederick Douglass is his BFF and they hung out last week, right? I mean, like, as a historian, it's kind of like you watch this and your impulse is to just be like, to laugh it off. And that's what I think most people do. Their response is to be like, oh, how funny, like these idiots don't know the real kind of like history. But like, I mean, the fact is that like they are pushing a different version of history through sheer blunt force, and to try to kind of establish it as having some sort of authority, at least enough authority to kind of erode the kind of hegemony of historical record that we are kind of used to. And we can't just laugh that off. The stakes are actually much higher than I think we think they are. And the thing that I was kind of adding in the Boston Review piece is that the very kind of mechanisms of historical memory itself are actually kind of being changed as we speak. Like they are being attacked, and they are also kind of just being reformatted by our connection in our connectivity in kind of the 21st century media landscape. And it's a landscape that someone like Trump is much more adept at navigating. And I guess to make that concrete, what I mean is that our capacity for like long-term historical memory is evaporating before our eyes, right? I mean, I can hardly remember, what happened 2 weeks ago, right? I mean, because like everything just moves so quick. There's so much fucking content.
Max, to be fair, I don't even remember what we started talking about in this episode. I have no idea.
Right, but like again, like in that sort of in that kind of landscape where you do not have the kind of long-term historical memory to really work in your favor, someone like Trump can just thrive because he never lets history hold him accountable for anything, right? I mean, he just keeps on chugging forward and, like, you know, leaving shit in his wake, and we're just, like, trying to catch up, right? I mean, there is no kind of, like, system of accountability that a long-term historical memory maybe used to have at any point, where, you know, a question about what someone said at another time contradicts what they're saying now, like, that has no purchase anymore. And it has to do with kind of...
That's so interesting.
I think that liberals do that too, to an extent as well. I mean, look at how someone like Martin Luther King has been turned into someone who basically just was nice to white people until white people gave black people civil rights, right? And look at how...
And Aisling, did you know that everyone loved Martin Luther King all the time?
Oh, yeah.
He had no conflicts. There's no issues.
I so much love the people who are really mad at Black Lives Matter but think they would have marched with Martin Luther King. That is my favorite shit. That is amazing. But, like, I think you've always had this... So, yeah, for example, if people think... in a Western, maybe not in Europe so much, but in the US about socialism, they might think about like the USSR or Mao's China or something like that. But I mean, even in the US where you have not had a socialist government, I mean, you've had, you know, massive, you know, union movements and workers' rights that gave people, you know, the weekend and got rid of child labor and stuff like that. And there's a lot of radical history that kind of gets rolled over. And I think I think Max really has a point that we talk too much about history as a linear thing. There's a book that I want to read that I have not read yet. It's called Backlash, I think. I forget the name of the author. But it's basically a history of feminism and women's rights, but specifically in terms of each time women's rights were rolled back. So it's sort of, instead of portraying things in a linear fashion, it looks at cases where, like, every time there were women's rights and then the backlash and then the way they could be rolled back. And I think it's always worth remembering that, yeah, things can be rolled back. Things aren't linear. And you have to keep fighting for stuff.
No, that's interesting. And that shows that the struggle, because, you know, I'm thinking about political possibility and reading like Ernst Bloch, who talks about how people tend to think of the past as a simple trajectory and they forget that there's rupture. And so things that people think impossible just happen all of a sudden and dramatically change things. Of course, brought about by struggle and contestation and so forth. But yeah, I guess it's important to realize that things can go backwards as well. No, that's very good.
Yeah, and I think this is good. We're probably over an hour here. Good spot to finish up. Any last comments before we quit here? Things you want to plug or articles you've written?
I've noticed that so Nathan J. Robinson, my lovely editor at Current Affairs, has... I think Current Affairs now has almost 100,000 likes on Facebook, and he was quite happy about that. So if you can go like it on Facebook and subscribe to the print edition if you can. It's really pretty and really nice, and I write really stupid things in there. And it's a really good sign of an editor where they let you do your stupidest ideas. That's the sign of a true gentleman and a scholar and an editor.
I've got an article coming up in the next issue, I believe. So definitely subscribe to Current Affairs. It's good stuff.
Yes.
And also, you know, no one believes what you're saying. It's beautiful to have humility and self-deprecation, though. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so 100% agree that everyone should subscribe to Current Affairs and listen to their wonderful podcast as well. The episode I did with Nathan was recently unlocked, and I think Nathan, Ashling, the Briannas, like everyone there is just doing incredible work. Sparky, Pete. So definitely go check out Current Affairs. Check out the Baffler. That's where my column is. We're putting out really great stuff all the time. And yeah, I mean, like I said before, if if you want to, I always love kind of doing podcasts like this because it gives me a chance to kind of just nerd out a bit in a different register. But like on my podcast, like, I'm talking to workers, I'm talking to labor organizers. Like it has a different tenor, and I don't get to go on a long rant about why conservative comedy sucks. So so I appreciate that. So I mean, if you guys listening want to also mix into your media diet a podcast where we have kind of in-depth human kind of deep conversations with workers around the country. We talk about their lives, their jobs, their dreams, their struggles. I would definitely say, check us out. We just released a really special episode where I interviewed my dad and my three tios, his three siblings, and we talk about the family history from them sleeping on the same bed in a wooden shack in Tijuana to kind of where they are today. And it's a really great conversation. So check us out.
That's awesome, Max. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great podcast. Check it out. And Max, if you ever want to come back, and you got me all excited when you dropped names like Bergson and Aristotle and Hobbes. I just got all tingly. So just come back on anytime. And anyway, Ashling, it's not a first because we did have Vanessa B on, so we had a current affairs person on already, but it's the second guest from Current Affairs, so that's pretty good. And you have a very plummy, wonderful voice. And both of you, I got to say, I just I'm coming to love with all of your voices. So come on the pod anytime you want, and we would love to have you.
Yeah.
Hell yeah! Thanks for having us on, guys.
Thanks very much.
All right, take care.
Cool.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.